And the purpose of the paper, very obviously, is to examine the nature of the so-called new atheism and to see what, if anything, is genuinely new about it. And so just to spoil the answer for you all from the beginning, my argument is that there are things about new atheism that are genuinely new, but that it represents some kind of hybrid mix between a commitment to enlightenment values, rationality and reason and science, with postmodern commitments towards identity politics and treating culture as a terrain of political struggle. So, the slides are not very good, by the way. These are just supplementary things. So anyway, the new atheism emerges 10 years ago. You can literally trace it back to the publication of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, 2006, and it's been one of the main forces driving contemporary debates around politics and religion. And it's attracted a lot of high-profile commentary, particularly from authors like Richard Dawkins is the obvious one, okay? But the label New Atheism itself has various problems with it. One of the problems with this is that there's no actual consensus as to what New Atheism actually is. And so academic analyses of New Atheism are fairly limited. Most of the stuff that gets written on New Atheism is theologically, is basically a theological critique of New Atheism. It's people who don't like New Atheists. There's not many scholars who are actually working on New Atheism itself, so there's no consensus around what New Atheism is. People describe it in various different ways, they understand it in various different ways. Most accounts typically centre on, as you can see here, this thing called the Four Horsemen, right? This is Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and it gets really annoying when people say this, because you see this all the time in the media, right? This is basically a flag which says, I don't know what I'm talking about in respect of New Atheism. If you see anything which just says New Atheism is the Four Horsemen, you should just stop reading that thing straight away, and they should just go on the naughty step and be, banned from polite society. Because there's a whole bunch of people beyond the Four Horsemen who are also constitutive of New Atheism who never really get a look in on this kind of thing. As you can see here, there's a whole bunch of them, right? Ophelia Benson, Jerry Coyne, P.Z. Myers, Greta Christina, Victor Stenger, A.C. Grayling, and so on and on and on and on. But the ones who always get the attention is this Four Horsemen thing, and it does get sort of very irritating. And you'll see things in the press as well, which will be like, oh, the New Atheists are Islamophobic because Sam Harris made a tweet that was horrible to Muslims, or Richard Dawkins said something stupid about Muslims on Twitter, and that means New Atheists are Islamophobic. As if you can take the whole New Atheist viewpoint to just what one or two people will say. It's ridiculous. So there are lots of New Atheists, is my point. It's also primarily an Anglo-American phenomenon. It's mostly in the United States, and so what I'm about to describe as what New Atheism is really New Atheism from the US. So, problem number one, there's no consensus as to what New Atheism is, but if you kind of boil it down to its basic things, you get something like this. Now this is, for presentational purposes for today only. This is not a sort of, these are the only things involved in New Atheism, but these are sort of the basic points, right? First of all, you have a naturalistic worldview. So New Atheism has an emphasis on reason and rationality and science as being the best, actually the only proper way of understanding reality. Secondly, New Atheism has a view of religion as being propositional, which is to say that New Atheism argues that religion makes truth claims about the world. So religion makes claims about the nature of reality that can be treated, that can be taken as a scientific hypothesis and can be tested. So because of this, which gives us the third feature of the list, New Atheists argue that because no actual evidence has ever been provided that will support and justify the claims that religion makes about reality, religion should therefore be rejected as being false. And then fourthly, which of course Marcus is going to talk about later on, this leads on to the view that religion is not just wrong, but it's pathological, it's irrational, and it's uniquely dangerous. So religion, because it's based on ideas of revealed authority and subjective preferences, like I just believe that God exists or I just feel that God exists, rather than actual hard scientific empirical evidence, this leads to in-group and out-group dynamics, and it leads to prejudice and discrimination and violence. So new atheists then take a very, very strongly critical approach towards religion, and it's not just extreme religious viewpoints that they attack, by the way, like ISIS or the sort of Tea Party evangelicals in the United States. New atheists also attack moderate religion, because moderate religion is seen to be this sort of mainstream in the middle, legitimises and justifies a belief in things without evidence, and so moderate religious beliefs are just as much criticised as extreme religious beliefs. So that's one problem with new atheism, is there's no consensus as to what it is. Another problem, though, is that this idea of a new atheism creates a binary opposite with some kind of old atheism, which raises a whole other bunch of problems around what old atheism actually is. Old atheism is never really defined and set out and characterised, and so this whole dynamic between the two is also a bit of a problem. So atheism itself, if you to go back and sort of talk about what old atheism might be, atheism itself is usually charted from ancient Greece. There are various other communities in other parts of the world around this time that also have a sort of claim to it, but they don't go anywhere in terms of developing sophisticated philosophical ideas. So it really goes back to the ancient Greeks. The term atheism itself comes from the Greek atheos. Atheism, though, in ancient Greece was not the sort of modernist version of atheism, which is a kind of rejection, an explicit rejection of God, right? God does not exist, what modern atheism would be. Atheism in ancient Greece is more a term of abuse for flinging at people who might question or doubt the existence of the officially sanctioned Greek and then later Roman gods. So it almost has a kind of political element to it from the beginning. If you wanted to discredit somebody who you didn't like, you would do them down in society, you would call them an atheist, and then they would become hounded out and treated like rubbish and be forced to sort of leave and live in the hills and so on. The earliest Christians, by the way, were described as atheists, ironically, because they refused to worship the gods of Rome, right? So this early version of atheism is not as we would understand it today. Modern atheism, which is actual unbelief, the explicit rejection of God, remains, so far as it exists, limited to a small number of individuals in the intelligentsia and the upper classes, and it's not until the onset of modernity and science and rationality and then the Enlightenment and the French Revolution that atheism in its modern form starts to come about. And here then, we've just got a few bunch of examples. Who might you term the old atheists, right? It was quite a big range, but I could have put some ancient Greeks on here too, just to, the list would just go on and on and on. But just some examples. Jean Meslier, the first explicit statement of modern atheism that we know of, but he didn't want to publish it, so he kind of wrote this treatise of atheism and then hid it away, and it was only discovered after he died, which was understandable because he was a Catholic priest, so that would have been problematic. Denis Diderot, the co-author of the Encyclopedia, who wrote the famous phrase you've probably heard of, that we would never be free until the last king was strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Percy Shelley, who wrote the first explicit statement of atheism in English, and was then kicked out of Oxford University for doing it. Charles Bradlaugh, founder of the National Secular Society, also the last person to be imprisoned in the Tower of London because he got into a fight in the House of Commons because he was an atheist and they refused to let him take his seat. Anthony Flew, a whole bunch of people. These are some of the old atheists, is just my point, right? So it's not until you get to the 20th century that atheism, as we now kind of understand it, really starts to take shape and starts to become a mass, mainstream, acceptable point of view. And so this just raises the point, if you talk about new atheism, you've got to talk about old atheism. But who are the old atheists? I mean, really, can we categorise everybody from ancient Greece until 2006 as being old atheism, as if that's even a thing? And what are the characteristics of old atheism? What are the differences between old and new? And all of this stuff is never explained. So, what then are, I'm just checking my time, what are the differences between old and new atheism? One of the key points in this, right, is the term new atheism was brought up and created by critics of Richard Dawkins et al. As a way of undermining their arguments. This wasn't a scholarly, neutral, objective formulation of the way in which certain ideas had changed. This was a political label that was attached to Dawkins and so on as a way of discrediting them. So the argument typically went something like, look at those new atheists over there, and then, ironically, the argument then went, and their arguments aren't even new, so we can't take them seriously, right? So the term new atheism was not coined by the new atheists themselves. But there are similarities between old and new atheism. So here's one. This is in terms of one of the things that the critics of new atheism will say is that it's aggressive, it's rude, it's intolerant, and so on. I'm not going to, you'll be glad to know, read through these quotes, but just some examples. I could have taken this off and said, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, right? And page 251, and nobody would have blinked. You could easily see Richard Dawkins saying something like this, as it happened to Ernestine Rose, 1861, atheism is natural until it becomes perverted by superstition, and so on. Equally, Robert Ingersoll wasn't even an atheist, the so-called great agnostic, right? Again, also in the 19th century, in a world of superstition, reason is blasphemy. In a world of ignorance, facts are blasphemy. Again, equally, old atheists and new atheists share this antipathy and this hostile rhetoric. So in terms of the rhetoric and the intolerance and the dogmatism and all of that, which doesn't really exist, I don't think, but you can make those sort of comparisons between the two things. So there are certain similarities between them. However, there are also things that are new, and here's my sort of final 4 minutes list. This is what's really new, in my opinion, about new atheism, really, really quickly. Okay, number one, the political focus of new atheism. Old atheism, insofar as it had a political focus, was really about trying to bring about some kind of separation of church and state. Now, new atheists also would quite like that, but also new atheists go beyond this, and there is this thing which I mentioned at the beginning about this mixture of postmodern issues taking culture as a terrain of political struggle. One of the things that new atheists want to do is take on religion in the private, personal sphere. This is about trying to change people's beliefs, right? Rather than saying, okay, you're fine to have your beliefs, but the private and the public things are separate. New atheism goes after religion in the private sphere of culture. That's a key difference, I think, from old atheism. Secondly, the new atheist view of religion itself as being propositional, as a scientific hypothesis, is also qualitatively different from old atheism. Old atheists, to a large extent, said, well, quite happy for religion to coexist. We're quite happy to kind of rub along with it as long as they didn't intermingle too much. New atheism has a very, very different view of religion. It's it's violent, it's discriminatory, and so on. Thirdly, the emphasis on science is qualitatively different as well. Old atheists argued against religion, but typically didn't bring scientific arguments into it. A lot of the new atheist arguments against religion are explicitly based on scientific arguments. You could think of Richard Dawkins and evolution, for example. I mean, he explicitly says evolution led him to atheism, right? This is a scientific proposition, evidence that led him to an atheist position, and he argues for atheism on that basis. Fourthly, which is one of the most important points of all this actually, is the role of the internet. The internet has been absolutely crucial in the rise of new atheism because it's a way of allowing people to communicate with each other and spread ideas. If you're a kid in Texas or Alabama or one of these states that are highly religious, and you're living in a religious community and you're kind of questioning it, where do you go? 20 years ago, you're kind of stuck, right? Now, you can go online, you can read this stuff, and then delete your internet history afterwards, nobody finds out. The internet has been really crucial for spreading ideas and for helping people to organise themselves online. Most of the stuff that happens in terms of new atheism happens online. Fifthly, is this use of identity politics. Again, as I said earlier on, this postmodern mixture between Enlightenment values and identity politics. New atheism is also, in the United States, highly about creating a sense of atheist identity, and people will identify themselves explicitly as an atheist. And this isn't a settled thing, this is an ongoing issue. The idea of what makes an atheist identity is being reformulated and redesigned on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. But this is one of the big distinctions between old and new atheism, is this idea of identity and identity politics. And then finally here is this idea that there is an atheist movement, particularly in the United States, and one of the key features of this, which again is a big difference to old atheism, is this movement has various schisms within it. There are tensions over political strategy. So, for example, there's a big division between the extent to which we should try and accommodate religion and get along with religious views and organisations, or whether we should take this very strict zero-tolerance approach to religion and be completely hostile. There's one tension between accommodationism and agonism is the debate there. There are also tensions between whether or not there are sufficient numbers of women, ethnic minorities in new atheism, and how those differences are about to be reconciled too. And then one final thing, just because I'm out of time here, there was a seventh as well. New atheism, ironically, is being driven by a sense of crisis. So what a lot of atheists thought This is one of the foundational ideas of the whole of the social sciences, right? This idea of secularization. Religion is going to disappear. And it didn't happen. And so this created a kind of a backlash from people, particularly when religion then, in the early years of the 21st century, started to return to the public sphere. And this is one of the things that has led to the new atheism, is this questioning of why hasn't secularization happened, why isn't religion dead, why isn't it coming back, and what do we do about it? Well, new atheism is one of the responses to all of that. So finally then, my conclusion is, new atheism is an interesting mix of old ideas about enlightenment, values, science, rationality and reason, but it's also a mixture, a hybrid mixture of these things with postmodern ideas of culture as a terrain of struggle and the use of identity politics. So there are genuinely new things about new atheism, but it's not entirely as the critics of new atheism would have us believe. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thank you very much for listening.